my favorite stories in the New Testament is in John 4, the woman at the well. Now, why I love that story is because it's a beautiful, subversive, and also scandalous picture of the grace of Jesus. But one of the things we don't really pay attention to is at the beginning that I think even makes it a little bit more weightier and a little bit more heavy. And that's in the first two verses, or the first couple verses. It says that Jesus left Judea and he departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. Now you're like, Jeff, that's actually kind of boring. That's geographical. I kind of failed that subject in high school. Me too, by the way. But why that's so fascinating is because there's a lot more going on there. First century context, as a Jew, the custom was to actually not go through Samaria. If you look at a map and you're going from that point A to that point B, you take the long way and you go around Samaria simply because Jews didn't like to hang out with Samaritans. They didn't want to be around them. It was declared that they were unclean, so they didn't want to associate with them. But it says Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had this idea and this notion that his grace, his kingdom movement was going to break down these racial, gender, economic, social barriers. And that's the truth about religion and grace and Jesus wants to make friends. He wants to break down these barriers. Religion usually puts up these barriers. And so you see him break down that wall and he says, I'm going to Samaria, I'm going to go through. And when the story unravels, he gets to this well and he starts having this conversation with this Samaritan woman. And then Jesus and this woman come to a very telling point where he says, go and call your husband. And then she says, I have no husband. He says, yes, I know you've had many before, and kind of alludes to her promiscuity or kind of her life of sin. And then she says, sir, I perceive you're a prophet. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, duh, right? He's even more so than that. But what you see in that text that's fascinating is that Jesus meets this woman, and then he then is breaking down these barriers. And then in the breaking down of those barriers, he offers grace. He gives this kind of this love, this compassion, knowing everything about her. She can't hide. She's exposed. And he says, I'm the living water that you have been looking for. And what I love about that is that just shows that scandal of grace that makes enemies into friends. Now, my question is, why was that so unique then? Why is that story so explosive? Why is that story kind of so countercultural, especially in first century context? And the answer is similar to first century, kind of like how we are today. We don't like to break down those barriers. We actually do the opposite. We like to put up walls. We like to stay in our safe little bubbles, only hang out with people who talk like us, act like us, do this like us, and we make ourselves the center of the story, whether it's moral, economic, whatever it is. And the problem with that is when you make yourself the center of the story, the spotlight's on you, then all of a sudden people are no longer friends, they become competition. They become enemies because they're not neighbors to be loved, they're people to compare yourselves to so that you can feel better than yourselves. I talk about in my book, my kind of narrative, my testimony, where in high school, I was this kid that thought, I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't have sex, so I'm better than everyone else. And it started kind of creating in me this spirit of pride, this spirit of me kind of being above others. And then what it does is it's like this poison that just kind of festers your relationships. Because again, no longer are they friends, now people are competition. They're people for me simply to compare myself to, simply to try harder to be better than them. And that's what religion does. When the spotlight's on you, it's all about comparing. But when it's about grace and the spotlight's on Jesus, you realize, hey, we're all on the equal playing field. The one thing I realized when I really actually got impacted by grace, I kind of had a similar moment to the woman at the well, is when you make something other than Jesus central, which is idolatry, right? If you worship something else, you elevate it to a point of you make that your God, you take your satisfaction and your worth from that outside of Jesus. That's an idol, meaning it's like a fake God, it's a pseudo counterfeit God. But when you do that, there's just this natural kind of rhythm to humanity where whatever your idol is, you then demonize the opposite, right? And know what I mean by that? I mean, like some people, instead of Jesus at the center, they'll make politics the center. So whether it's Republican or Democrat, if they elevate one of those, then the opposite opposite is the demonized position. So if you think Republican politics are the way to make the world transform and bring God's kingdom here on earth, then probably to you probably think the enemy of the world is liberal democratic politics, or you can reverse that, whatever it is. I played sports my whole life, so I've seen this even play out in Yankees Red Sox. I've seen this play out in Duke, North Carolina, and we laugh about that, but if you ask Duke or North Carolina fans if they don't like each other, they probably wouldn't laugh about it. So when you idolize something, you always demonize the opposite. But when you look at Jesus and you actually put him in his rightful place, then the opposite of that would be demons, right? You demonize demons, you demonize the spiritual forces, the dark powers that are at work that the scriptures talk about. And that seems pretty normal to me. That seems like everything is finally working how it's supposed to be working. And that's the truth, is who's the enemy to you? Who's the enemy? Is the enemy politics? Is it some type of racial group? Is it some gender that you aren't, that you maybe don't like, which we've seen all throughout world history? What is the answer to that question? The truth is, none of that is true. The truth is, sin is the enemy, right? I think a lot of us, we think this person, it's always us versus them, rather than us maybe versus the wrath of God, right? Because the truth is, when you read the scriptures, you see this narrative of it's kind of us pitted against God, and not in the sense of a certain way, but there's this separation because of sin. There's this separation, there's this distance that has happened, there's this fracturing that's happened when sin entered the world, where it's kind of put us and God kind of separated from each other. But the beauty, when you read that narrative and you read that arc of the Bible, you see that God, in that separation, is doing everything in his power to actually close that gap, to actually rescue us, and he has achieved that by sending himself in the person and work of Jesus, rising from the grave and creating this new, beautiful kingdom, grace-filled movement that then kind of vacuums that all together and says, no, when you trust in me, when you trust in grace, we are one. Some of you might even be saying, well, Jeff, yeah, that kind of makes sense, but I really am better than other people. Or what about, I do this, I'm on the honor roll, I got A's all through school, I got the best job, whatever it is. I don't know what your kind of, criteria is, but you might be saying that and saying, so I'm better than this person, and this person, and these really evil people, right? Now, first of all, comparing yourselves to someone who maybe is kind of the worst person you can think of really isn't the best logic. That's like kind of trying to get your reflection in a pool of mud, right? No one goes, when they want to look at themselves, they don't go look at mud. They don't go look at the dirtiest thing and say, hey, what do I look like, right? When you look at mud, it actually gives you the worst reflection of who you are. If you want to see who you are and you want to see what you look like, you actually look in a clear, perfect reflection, which is Jesus, right? And when you look at that, you realize, man, I don't cut it. I don't make it. We're all in need of grace. Even the breath that I have to even talk is a gift of grace from the holy, creator, beautiful, amazing God. And the other thing I think of is, again, if you compare yourself to each other, that's kind of like, the way I like to think about it, it's kind of like jumping to Hawaii, right? Now, just to give some context, I live in the Seattle area, so we're on the West Coast. Now, if you just keep going left in a certain direction, you will reach Hawaii sooner or later. But let's say we all kind of got on the coast and we all at the beach and we all wanted to jump to Hawaii, right? And now let's say we're all standing there and then we say, okay, you go. And then the first person jumps and I don't know, maybe they have a ton of jump skills and they get maybe 6 to 10 feet out off the coast and everyone cheers and like, oh, that's really great, that's really awesome, right? And so then let's say that I jump and I maybe only get maybe 2-3 feet out. I'm kind of scared of the water because I can't really swim, but don't tell anyone that because it's really awkward and my child will probably learn to swim before I do. But anyways, let's say I jump, right? And that person who jumped farther out then kind of turns around and says, and kind of laughs at me or points at me and says, haha, you didn't really jump that far, you're not that good, you're not that awesome, or something of that nature, right? Now, that might make sense when he's comparing himself to me, but when you look at the goal of trying to get to Hawaii, it's like, dude, that's a couple thousand miles away, and comparatively, we're actually both really far away from that goal. And I think a lot of us, we need to realize that's more the narrative of the scripture, that Jesus has lived this perfect life. He died, he rose again, and comparing ourselves or trying to be good enough without him is kind of like comparing yourselves to jumping to Hawaii, the person next to you, but rather see that Jesus has done that, Jesus has achieved, Jesus has died, rose again, and when you understand that, there is grace for you to no longer compare yourselves to each other, but realize, hey, we're all in the same family, we're all going somewhere, there's beautiful, awesome love and compassion in the person and work of Jesus, and our job is now to invite people to jump with us. One other thing I think of is when I was in college, there was this concept a lot of my professors had of grading a lot of papers on a curve. Now, some people liked that, some people didn't, but basically what it meant is whoever got the highest grade in the class, rather than grading to 100, whoever got the highest grade, like let's say someone maybe got a 90 or an 80 or a 96, whoever got the highest grade, that would then turn into kind of the new 100, and everything would be graded in accordance with whatever that grade was at the top. So basically it just meant everyone's grade got kind of bumped up a little bit because it was all in comparison to each other. Now, I think a lot of times, again, we think God does that. We think God says, well, he's really good, but there's a lot of us that are just kind of decent, and then he's really bad, but it's gonna all be on a curve anyways, and so most of the people are in the middle, and they'll just get in because they're just like everyone else. Now, the problem with that is I don't think God really grades on a curve. I think he grades on a cross, meaning Jesus and the standard we see at the hill of Golgotha and then his resurrection is the thing that we are judged by. Like, have we accepted that? Have we bent the knee to that? Or have we not? But here's the truth. There's so much freedom in the fact that God doesn't grade on a curve, that he grades on a cross. And there's freedom because you don't have to play the comparison game anymore. When you play the comparison game, then that's just an endless cycle of disappointment. That's this endless cycle of you trying to make sure you can find people who you're better than so you feel good about yourself, and then trying to hide all the people who are better than you so you don't feel terrible about yourself. But when you realize that God grades in Jesus and it's all about him and there's grace for everyone, it just crushes that comparison game. It crushes that cycle of disappointment, and you realize we all have empty pockets. We're all hungry in need of the bread of life, Jesus. And when we come to him asking for that, looking for that, people are no longer competition. They're no longer enemies. They're now friends that we want to invite to eat at that table, to eat at that feast as well. Because the truth is, the two greatest commandments Jesus talked about, to love God and love others, they go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, because when you are plugged into God's love, you will then in turn go and love others. One of the biggest truths I kind of want you to walk away with from this session is that concept of that religion makes enemies, Jesus makes friends. That idea that when you compare yourself to one another, or your morality is kind of the center of the story, then it's exhausting, it's disappointing, and it then puts you in a place where you never have that joy you're looking for. But when you realize we're all on an equal playing field, we're all on a level playing field, and we're all in need of grace, and Jesus is the one we're all looking towards, that's what it's all about. That's where true joy is found, and that's where we can walk and live a life that is truly meaningful. And lastly, I think again of the story of the woman at the well that we started with at the beginning. I love how Jesus says he had to go to Samaria. Remember how we talked about that he didn't? Most people actually went around. And so the first question I want you to leave with is, have you understood that Jesus doesn't go around you, he goes straight to you. Jesus doesn't go around your sin. He doesn't go around your stuff. He doesn't want to not touch you because you're unclean. He goes straight to you, knows everything about you, and then gives you grace and says he's the living water. And then next, if you keep reading that story, by the way, she then goes to her town after hearing that, which by the way, it was the first time that Jesus declared himself as the Messiah in the Gospel of John to an adulterous Samaritan woman. That is fascinating. And then she turns around, goes to her town and says, let me tell you about a man who told me everything and knows everything about me. Do you receive that grace? Do you understand that God doesn't go around you, he goes straight to you? And then when you understand that, do you turn around and go to others and realize they're not your enemy, they're friends, and we're all in need of grace?